As time goes by, even if the journey is a rocky one, video games are trying harder and harder to flourish as a narrative medium. I see this not just as a good way to bring interesting new stories into the world, but also as a method of offering new types of narrative that can only be achieved in an interactive space. This is why I've always been interested in the elements intrinsic to video games that separate them from other forms of storytelling. One of these is an aspect very few other forms of media have, the ability for the user to trigger a fail state.
What's wrong? Answer me! Guidance!
It's a component of the medium most of us take for granted at this point. If you die in most video games, you simply reappear at a designated location. But if we take into consideration the narrative ramifications of such an element, it can be a downright peculiar detail. If a player character dies in gameplay, their failure is simply wiped from the narrative, giving the user the ability to retry and attempt to complete the story as the writers intended. This is one of the issues video games face as a narrative medium. Their purpose is to give the participant control of a character, even in some cases letting them model that character after themselves, but at the end of the day, they're still at the mercy of what the writers want that character to do, how they want them to act, or when they want them to die. The issue is compounded by the fact that in a lot of narrative-heavy games, the story is many times isolated to sections with none or very little interactivity. At some points, the user is allowed to freely affect the outcome of the events in the game world, whether it be surviving or getting killed. But then at any moment, they can be thrown into a cutscene or scripted event and be at the mercy of what the writers exclusively want. Game narrative, in a sense, most of the time almost exists in two different states. One in which death is inconsequential to the outcome of the story, and another in which it's absolute. Very few titles integrate the player's ability to die into the way the narrative plays out, and even less outright acknowledge it as a way to offer up new dynamics to the story. But I think it may be something we should be looking into in further detail if we intend to devise more coherent experiences with stories that don't feel like they were just tacked on between the chunks of the game that are deemed inconsequential enough to the narrative to be interactive. Because at some point we have to start admitting that it's a little hard to take video games seriously as a narrative medium if all gameplay boils down to is some sketchy recreation of what could have been represented in a non-interactive space, with procedural generation being irrelevant to the overall plot. Death is an interesting element of this issue because the aspect of dying and having to repeat a section of a title again is something very few designers try to tie into the overall story or way the game universe works. I'm not saying by any means it has to be done this way, but I am surprised it isn't played with more, considering fail states are such a fundamental aspect of the design in so many titles. It's easy to essentially canonize player death if you're a fun parody game like Conker's Bad Fur Day, but what if the attempt is to work around fail states in a more serious context? One game that tried really hard to do this was the 2008 Prince of Persia reboot. Now trust me, I'm not much a fan of Pop 2008's brand of restrictive platforming and repetitive objectives, but I did find its approach to fail states rather interesting. You can't actually quote-unquote die, instead your companion Elika simply recovers you before you fall and places you back in a safe location. This mechanic essentially means the player can fail, but it integrates that failure into the narrative structure of the game without the need to pretend it didn't happen. This worked pretty well for platforming in this case, but of course became a little hard to work around when it came to failure in combat. Another title that integrates the player triggering a fail state into the canon of the game quite naturally is Dark Souls. You play as the chosen undead in the story, which means that upon death you get brought back to life with the game's acknowledgement. It even plays into the gameplay at times, with a certain boss later on using this power the player has to their advantage by trying to trap them in an endless loop of death and revival within an enclosed area. The narrative-focused Heavy Rain attempted to give weight to character death by making it permanent. The game ties failing a given task into the flow of the story. So if one of the 4 playable characters is to get killed, it will weave its way into the plot. You can of course argue how effectively, this is Heavy Rain we're talking about. Then there's Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, an adventure game that did a surprisingly good job at integrating the protagonist Raziel's failure in combat at the player's hand into the game's universe in a fairly non-jarring fashion. As a zombie vampire bloke brought back to life by a god, Raziel is pretty much immune to the whole dying thing, so if he gets taken out when fighting, one of two things can happen. The game has a dual world mechanic in which the player can be in either what the title dubs the Spectral Realm or the Material Realm. If the player dies in the ghostly Spectral Realm, they'll be revived by the Elder God at the starting point of the game, where Raziel can access a portal system to take him back to the area where he got defeated. If the player gets killed in the fleshy Material Realm, they'll simply revert back to the Spectral Realm. This creates a cool little dynamic. The player can revert back to the Spectral Realm whenever they wish, but can only access the Material Realm through special portals. When trying to reach a destination in the Material Realm, getting kicked back to the Spectral Realm upon defeat forces the player to learn the environment a little more thoroughly, as well as just naturally being a cool explanation for how Raziel keeps coming back. Of course, most games don't try to make death diegetic, so to speak, and instead, depending on the title, there are a plethora of different methods games use to offer the player a way to bring back characters after a fail state, whether it be save points, quick saving, or checkpoints that activate behind the scenes, where a developer thinks it most benefits the flow of the title. It's very rare, though, for a game to tie these features into the actual plot, or make the characters aware of their presence at all, which is a disconnect people who play games are pretty much used to at this point. Some titles lessen this disconnect by tying the physical presence of save points into the game world somehow. For just one example, the Metroid Prime title titles dub save points in-game as places the inhabitants of the universe can perform data backup, where a character, in this case the player-controlled Samus, can record the information they've discovered. This puts the player and Samus on the same page. While Samus in the game isn't banking on getting restored back to life at these locations upon death, she does want to preserve any data she's collected while exploring, much like the person playing the game. This can help mitigate the disconnect somewhat, allowing the player and protagonist to feel somewhat as one when interacting with the immersion-breaking asset a save point can be, which works especially well in the case of Metroid Prime. This is just one example I'm very acquainted with though, and there are a plethora of others that litter the gaming landscape. If the developer chooses to add their checkpoints in at designated points without notifying the player like many titles do today, it becomes important to spread them out in a way that preferably doesn't give an advantage to the player or the enemies they must face. It should be a balanced relationship, with the difficulty being dictated by the game and not the revival points. But you could look at this exclusively as a facet of gameplay. If we're to accept the interactive and non-interactive segments of a title as one complete string of proceedings, then it can have small effects on the way the player perceives the game's events. In a game like Bayonetta, if the player dies taking on a boss, it can take the wind out of the fight to get brought back halfway in with full life, as it basically equates to getting a free energy refill at a random point in the battle. I mean, is Bayonetta's victory really justified when she got such a get-out-of-jail-free card? Hard to rationalize saying you triumphed over a foe when the devs give you such an advantage. Usually this kind of thing is ignored, though thematically to the player, or at least my masochistic sensibilities, it made for far less climactic confrontations. Maybe if the designers don't want the boss fight to be as hard or frustrating, then perhaps it should be made shorter by giving the boss less health on the lower difficulties for those with worse skill levels. Bayonetta, though, is a small offender. I'm pretty sure most probably think I'm crazy for wanting mid-boss fight checkpoints removed. But if you want a real good example of how a checkpoint system can screw up a game, look no further than the original BioShock. BioShock was a title that tried to implement fail states diegetically, and while it did tie it in somewhat into the game's twist, saying it was far-fetched is selling it short. No, the real issue is how poorly this affected how the title played. In BioShock, if the player dies, they're brought back to life at small green resurrection tubes scattered throughout the game world that restore the players but not the enemy's health upon failure. In other words, there's no penalty for getting killed. If the player dies against a tough enemy, they can just come back to life and keep beating on them, chipping away at their health infinitely. To say this crippled any sense of dread or tension the game had is an understatement. This was done, of course, because killing enemies without dying would require the player to have a vast amount of finite resources. So if a checkpoint system that made completed progress absolute had been used, then the player might be permanently stuck if they didn't have the necessary supplies. Balancing an absolute checkpoint system with player-managed resources can be tricky, but definitely not impossible. So it feels like a cop-out for a game like BioShock to ruin its difficulty and atmosphere with such a ham-fisted mechanic like the Vita Chambers. Again, checkpoints shouldn't dictate the difficulty, the actual content of the game world should. Quicksaving is another very common player revival method, which has always interested me since its ability to give a player such a high amount of dominance over their respawn location can turn it in some cases into an integral strategy of the games where it's implemented. It does this in a rather disconnecting fashion, since it's basically adding a mechanic to a title that has no presence in the game world. For example, in a game like Half-Life 2, the character Gordon Freeman is strategizing purely about how to survive the current situation he's in, and not thinking about the magic button he can press to rewind time at a moment's notice. The use of manual checkpoint creation at any time can become so pervasive in that kind of game though that it creates a strategy for the player that doesn't exist for the character he's controlling, fashioning a small disconnect with the protagonist who the participant is supposed to be, or at least that can be the case for myself. To my knowledge, no title has integrated quicksaving diegetically into a game's plot, though feel free to correct me on that one if I'm wrong. Of course, quicksaving is an essential ability for certain titles. For just a single example, a game like Thief 2 that drops a player into non-linear sandbox-style levels to explore in a variety of different ways inherently necessitates this feature if a method of mid-level saving is going to be used at all, since it would be pretty hard for the developer to place checkpoints adequately themselves. Whatever the case, this is a very large topic that I don't really see getting analysed all that much. But since the player triggering the death of a character they're manipulating, whether it be intentionally or unintentionally, is an aspect of video games that no other form of media can replicate, it would be interesting to see more titles implement it in more intriguing ways. I've probably missed out loads of good instances though of integrating player death into narrative or devising ways of conveying that facet within the game world. Rogue Legacy, for example, is a title that was only recently released that has the player take up a new member of their character's family line every time they die, attempting to explore the game's large environment. But I'll stop here, I could be dissecting specimens all day. If you've got any cool examples you want to share though, feel free to discuss them in the comments or leave a response if you have ideas of your own.